Okay, this is podcast 4, Standard 5.3, in which we're going to take a closer look at natural selection and how the process of natural selection is closely linked to genetics and genetic diversity. So in this one, we will be describing the role that genetics plays in natural selection and in the biodiversity that we see of life on Earth. So we're going to start by talking about what biodiversity means. So biodiversity, when we hear that word, we think bio is life and diversity is variation. So it is the variation of the different life forms that are found living on Earth today. All the different living things. So not just the animals that are pictured here, but also all the plants and bacteria and fungus, every single living thing. Biodiversity will measure the health of a biological system. The way that this works is the more biodiversity there is within an area, the healthier that area is. So the more biodiversity that exists on Earth, the healthier the Earth is. And something that has been happening recently is there has been a decline in biodiversity on Earth due to pollution and natural disasters and other factors that it's decreasing the variation of the different species that we have. And that means that the health of the Earth is in decline. Now, all of the biodiversity that we do find on Earth today is a result of 3.8 billion years of evolution. So it's estimated the first life form existed on Earth about 3.8 billion years ago, and since then it has evolved into the millions of species that we now have. And remember that most of the species that have ever existed are now extinct because of natural selection and evolution. But we have more species that are now going extinct and being lost forever that are not evolving, and that is why biodiversity has been decreasing on Earth. So when we talk about biodiversity and we talk about species, really it comes down to the genetics of the species. So when we want to look at all of the genes that are found within a population, we call that collection of genes the gene pool. So every gene that a particular population of organisms has is considered the gene pool. Now, a population is a group of organisms that are the same species and they live in the same place. And so all of the genes that are available between the members of that same species that are living in that same place, that is their gene pool. The more variation that exists within the gene pool, the healthier that species is going to be, because it's more likely that they'll be able to adapt to different changes in the environment. So we want a gene pool that has a lot of variation within it. We do not want gene pools that are very small. So when we look at a gene pool, we can actually calculate allele frequency. What we can do is we can figure out how often a particular allele is showing up in a population, and that frequency is very often going to depend on how advantageous it is to have that allele. So if it's good to have a particular allele, then you will see that allele more in a population, and if it's not good to have an allele, then you won't see it. So in this population of frogs, obviously being green in this population seems to be advantageous over being blue or red. So you have more green alleles in the population than you do blue or red alleles. And that's because the green ones are surviving longer and they're passing on their green trait, whereas the blue and red ones may not be surviving as long or as well, and so they're not passing on their blue or red trait. So all of these different genes that we have in the gene pool and these different versions of different alleles are going to contribute to the genetic variation that we have within our populations. So the differences that are among the genes in the gene pool, that is our genetic variation, and that genetic variation may result from a couple of different processes that could occur. The first is mutation. We talked about mutation before. Mutation is a change in DNA sequence. Usually some kind of change in the nucleotide sequence within that DNA molecule is going to change in some way the protein that gets made. And that can lead to genetic variation because you're now changing the phenotype or the way that the protein is going to function. Another mechanism of genetic variation is gene shuffling, and gene shuffling happens during sexual reproduction. So this is like when we talked about shuffling the deck of cards. You're mixing the genes together during sexual reproduction, and that's going to give you more genetic variation. So we'll take a closer look at each of these here. We're going to start with mutation. So in a mutation, if a mutation is good, that means that it's going to increase the chances of survival for a particular group of individuals in a population, then you will start to see that population show up, that mutation show up more within the population. So anytime a mutation happens that is going to increase chances of survival, then you'll start to see that mutation come out more until it becomes a regular trait within that population. Okay, so remember, traits can be dominant or recessive, and it doesn't really matter if the mutation is recessive or dominant. If it's advantageous, then you're going to see it more. An example that we talked about before was the green peas. Green peas is a recessive trait. However, most of the peas that we see are green, and that is because we've selected for them because they have a better taste to them. So even though recessive doesn't mean worse. It depends on what kind of trait is going to be best in the particular environment that we're looking at. Okay, so anytime a mutation happens and it's going to increase the chance of survival, whether it's a dominant or recessive trait, you will start to see that more in the population because it's helping the population to survive. Gene shuffling is going to happen. Remember the deck of cards. So during sexual reproduction, organisms are going to make random mixtures of your parents' chromosomes. So what you are going to get some of your mom's chromosomes and some of your dad's chromosomes, and some of the ones you got from dad might come from his father or from his mother. It's random mixtures, and this is because of independent assortment. Remember that our chromosomes are not linked together. We have 46 different chromosomes, 23 pairs, and the way that they get passed on to you or to your offspring is completely independent of how the other chromosomes are getting passed on. So each one getting passed on is an individual event. So chromosome 1 is not always passed on with a particular chromosome 2. It could be either or. So because you're getting this random shuffling of your genes and your chromosomes from your parents, we get more variety of phenotypes within a population when we have sexual reproduction happening. So any organisms that reproduce sexually are going to have a greater amount of variety of phenotypes within their population. Where something like a bacterium, which is asexually reproducing, is just going to make a copy of its DNA, and it's just basically making copies of itself. So the only way that you can get genetic variation for a asexually reproducing organism is through mutation. And gene shuffling just does not occur. Okay, so when you have greater genetic variation, there's a better chance that the phenotype that's needed for survival will be found in the population. So the more sexual reproduction, the more mixing of genes that happens, the better chances you have of a phenotype being available within the population. Now, there might be a phenotype that exists that nobody even knows about until it's actually needed. And once it's needed and it allows certain members of the population to survive, they reproduce, pass on that mutation, and that is now going to become a common trait within that particular group. Okay, so remember in gene shuffling, we've got your two parents, and you are going to be mixing their genes. In this one, they're showing you the X and Y chromosomes. Okay, it's random. Your dad doesn't get to pick whether he gives an X or a Y. Mom doesn't get to pick which X she gives. It's just a random independent assortment of all of your chromosomes during that process. All right, so how does genetics relate to natural selection? Well, in order for evolution to happen, there has to be pressure. There has to be a reason for it to happen. We don't just evolve for the sake of evolving. So as our environment changes, members of a species have to adapt to those changes. So if there is a change in the environment, species have to adapt. If they don't adapt, they will die out. An adaptation is a genetic change that is going to increase the fitness of the population. It's a genetic trait that already exists within the population. You can't make it happen. Okay, so if it suddenly became advantageous for everybody to be 6 feet tall or higher, all of us that are under 6 feet, we can't make ourselves become 6 feet so that we survive. If we're under 6 feet, we're not going to survive. But those people that already have that adaptation and are over 6 feet are going to survive. Okay, so any with a genetic advantage are going to survive and reproduce more, and they're going to pass on that advantage. Think back to the giraffes. The giraffes with the longer necks got the food, and they passed on that long neck trait. They didn't stretch their neck out during their lifetime to get the longer neck. They were just born that way, and it ended up being an advantage, and they ended up passing it on, and then eventually all giraffes had longer necks. So a classic example of this is something called the peppered moth. And this is evolution that happened in real time, or natural selection really that happened in real time. So before the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s, there were birch trees all throughout England that had white bark. And so when you were a peppered moth and you were light colored, you had a survival advantage. You could sit on the outside of the tree and your predators couldn't see them. Whereas at this time when the trees were white, if you were a dark moth, you could be seen. So if you look at this picture here we've got one of our dark moths, clearly very visible against the white bark of the tree. Okay, but also in this picture there is a light colored moth that is almost invisible. So if you're a bird flying over this situation and you're hungry, you're going to grab this dark one. The light one is right here. And a lot of people can't even see it. So the bird is not going to grab that one because it doesn't even know it's there, but it's going to grab this one. So there's an advantage to being light in this example. So having the light phenotype is a good thing for the peppered moth, and that was before the Industrial Revolution. Now, during and after the Industrial Revolution, moths that had dark coloring were able to survive better. And that's because with the Industrial Revolution, we started to release a lot of pollution into the air, including soot from the factories. And that soot is dark, black, and it covered the birch trees, and it made the birch trees, which used to be white, now they were black. So now, if you are a dark-colored moth sitting on one of these trees, you're going to blend in, and the light-colored one is not. So again, if you're a bird flying over this situation, you can see that light-colored one very easily, and you can snag it. Now, you can still see the black one. It's not quite as blended in as in the last picture, but if you're a bird flying over, you're going to grab this one before this one because that one's going to catch your eye first. So it became a distinct advantage to have the darker phenotype. Okay? So there was evolutionary pressure from the environment for the moths to have a dark coloring, and that eventually became the common phenotype within the population. So the moths went from being mostly light colored before the Industrial Revolution to mostly dark colored after the Industrial Revolution. And that's because the dark colored ones ended up with the survival advantage. And now that we have more abatement programs and we're trying to control pollution, the light colored moths are starting to become more prevalent again, and we're starting to see them more and more in the populations. So this wasn't true evolution, but this was natural selection in real time. And we're going to take a look at a couple of those kinds of examples in class.